Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up, we're off to the US.
This is my city. I want to be part of what it becomes today, tomorrow, and for the future. And now I have grandchildren. My vision is that they're on bikes riding to school in 5 years because they'll feel safe doing it.
This week, we want to take the temperature of urban development in the US and check in with a few projects currently underway. We'll explore an initiative hoping to transform the land below Miami's elevated metro rail, discover Detroit's tallest skyscraper to be built from the ground up in 50 years, and hear about a new development in Pittsburgh aiming to reconnect residents with the riverfront once again. Plus, through sustainable design and feng shui, we meet an architecture firm working to redevelop the neighbourhood of Queens in New York. All that and much, much more over the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. Our first stop in our US tour this week is Miami, where a new initiative is hoping to transform the land below Miami's elevated metro rail. Spanning some 16 kilometres, the Underline will see the creation of a linear park, an urban trail, and will even become a destination for public art and hospitality too. Currently underway, the project is opening in phases as a way of minimising its impact on the city and commuters as it transforms such an expansive area. Earlier, Monocle's Carlotta Ribello caught up with Meg Daly, the founder of the Underline, to find out more about what the project is all about.
The Underline project is really a citizen-led movement to transform the way that we live in our city. We're one of those young cities that we don't walk and bike very much, really because infrastructure is not designed for that. And the Underline is taking over 10 miles, 120 acres of land below our elevated rail and turning it into a park and urban trails and a public art destination and a community activation space. And it was all really sort of started by a big idea I had. 10 years ago, I had a bike accident and broke both of my arms. And because I was not driving, because I couldn't, I was walking below metro rail to get to the doctor. And I thought, wow, why don't we turn all this dead land into a beautiful park and trail? So a lot of people helped. We have hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, and we partner with the Department of Transportation and Public Works at the county to bring this really beautiful, transformative project to the community.
Now, one of the interesting things about the project as well is how, of course, it's happening in phases, as all the projects do, but you are opening each of these phases to the public as it's ready. So phase 2 is the most recent one, if I'm not mistaken. Tell me about the 2 phases that are now open and that people are able to enjoy.
I think one of the hallmarks of this project is that we listen first and then we design. And we have a great team to work with, field operations out of New York. And so there was a lot of listening before we ever put pencil to paper. And phase 1 is in a very urban, very dense area. It's part of our downtown, connects to one of the more active and remote transit hubs in the county. And we have everything from basketball to soccer, 30,000 native plants and trees. Everything is dog friendly. And we have 6 art installations, and we program that with over 200 free events a year for the community. They were all their ideas, the community's ideas. They weren't mine. And then phase 2 goes through more single family residential areas. So we have less amenities. We have our first playground. We have a meditation area at the transit station. So if you're getting stressed out waiting for the train, you can meditate in guided meditation. And we have our first bioswale, which is green infrastructure to mitigate stormwater. So in this area, we really focus on everything is native planting. So the birds, the bees, and the butterflies are very happy that phase 2 opened recently with a big block party and a formal ribbon cutting.
One of the interesting things is almost these microforests that can be found dotted around the Underline. Just how important has that green element been to make this a greener project and to have resilience and sustainability in mind, which, as we know, is paramount to all new developments happening in cities?
Absolutely. If we can plan our cities not just for green offset, but driven by green infrastructure, we really have an opportunity to solve problems, not just mobility and safety, which this does, but how can we contribute to reducing the heat island effect from adding tree canopy? And in phase 3, which is a 7-mile implementation, phase 1 is half a mile, phase 2 is 2 miles, and the remaining 7 miles are under construction now. We're using a microforest technique designed by a Japanese designer named Miyake. And the Miyake method is basically, think of the size of a basketball court and overplant it with all these native trees and plants, and they all compete for sunlight. So it grows 10 times faster, 20 times more dense, and 30 times more biodiverse. And we'll have 24 of them in our future phase 3. So when we're done with this project, we'll have 500,000 native plants and trees in 120 acres.
Now, you mentioned there at the beginning also the mobility aspect of this. How big has that side of it been in all this planning and all these meetings? How high up in the agenda has the mobility and getting people from A to B been part of that discussion?
There's the theory, if you build it, they will come. And that's what we're finding. There's huge pent-up demand for people to have the freedom to bike and walk safely again. Only a very small percentage of the population feels safe in Miami-Dade County. It's one of the most dangerous places to walk and bike in the country. So adding these safe off-road facilities connected to transit really feeds into first and last mile connectivity into these neighborhoods. We connect to 24 schools. So the big idea is to get our kids back on bike and being able to walk or bike to school again, like I did. I'm 63, and we skipped a generation, my children, who weren't allowed to get on a bike and go to school. And so that is the key driver, is safe multimodal transportation. And what's interesting is really the bulk of the funding for the project, the total construction cost is $140 million, have come from transportation dollars. And then the park components are layered into that. That's the green and the recreational pieces. And then you have the art and the programs. So this is a plus, plus, plus of doing a lot with one facility that was intended for one use when it was designed.
This being such a community-driven project, and all it takes is to go to the Underline website to see all the info about the public meetings when they were taking place. So it is quite an open and transparent process. And I'm curious if you think that actually has made people be more engaged with the future of the Underline.
It is a lot of work to make people feel that they are informed. So this is not about putting a tombstone ad in a newspaper and hoping people maybe will come. Our public meetings are standing room only. Everything is documented in our master plan. We had 500 documented questions and 500 documented answers to every one of them. And so I think it's building this story of you not only are listened to, but your ideas are what inform this project. And I think that has made it sticky. So I feel like if I go and visit the Underline, that was my idea to have pickleball, because pickleball was not a thing when we master planned. That was my idea, that we only use native plants and trees and don't irrigate and don't fertilize. And so seeing that you are reflected in the project, I think makes people feel like not only do I belong, but it's mine.
My last question to you would be, what advice would you have for those who might be listening and want to bring change to their city? What can they take from your story and the Underline as a project?
I have a battle cry, which is show up. You need to show up. You must speak up. And believe me, people want to hear from you. And I think that we need to say, this is my city. I want to be part of what it becomes today, tomorrow, and for the future. And now I have grandchildren. My vision is that they're on bikes riding to school in 5 years because they'll feel safe doing it. And it wasn't my voice. It was the thousands of people who showed up with us to say that we want to be part of the future of this city. We want our voice represented in this. And the only way that can happen is if you show up and speak up.
Meg Daly in conversation with Carlotta Ribello a little bit earlier. Next, we're off to Detroit, a city which has been seeing a remarkable urban transformation over the past couple of years, ever since declaring bankruptcy all the way back in 2013. Few things mirror this rebirth of the city more than the Hudson site development, which is the tallest ground-up skyscraper to be built in Detroit in 50 years. Named after its location on the former J.L. Hudson's department store site, The tower is a modern reinterpretation of the Chicago school architectural icon that once drew residents and visitors downtown for shopping, dining and entertainment, and it's aiming to become a new dining, retail and office destination once again. Well, I'm joined now by Kofi Bonner, who's the CEO of Bedrock, the company behind the project. Kofi, thank you for joining us on The Urbanist. Now, I'm sure a lot of our listeners will remember a Detroit of the past which has struggled with bankruptcy and has floundered a bit in recent years. Tell us about this project and what it means for the Detroit of today.
The Hudson's Project is the second tallest building in Michigan and symbolic of the rebirth, we think, of just the downtown. And a strong downtown certainly is critically important for the strength of a city. And so we think that the Hudson's Project is indeed emblematic of the rebirth of this city.
And tell us about the history of the location and its significance to the city.
I've been in this city now in this position for about 3.5 years. And everybody has these really incredible memories, very fond, intimate memories of visiting the old J.L. Hudson's department store, which at its time, I believe, may have been the largest department store at a time in the United States of America. Just a symbol of the prominence of Detroit, in sort of days gone by, right? And then, of course, as in many of these really significant urban buildings that faded as the capital markets moved on, it became abandoned and then ultimately it was imploded and was a hole. It was a hole in the ground. And I think that hole in the ground became a symbol of the hole in the hearts of Detroiters as they walk by with these fond memories. So now for folks walking by over the last 3.5 years to have seen this hole now filled with this glorious building that is built not only to accept sort of commercial offices, but also with really cool event spaces and, of course, global brand for hospitality in the addition, I think their hearts are swelling again.
I know that just as the department store would have been a place where people rubbed shoulders with each other, gathered to shop, get ready for Christmas and all sorts of things, that there's an element of creating a gathering space with this project. How important is that when you do these pieces of large infrastructure, of new build, that you incorporate this notion of making people feel connected, that you make a space where people feel at ease, that they want to linger, to meet their friends, to hang out, to be entertained?
It is extremely important. It was important before the pandemic. It's become even more important with this hybrid work from home situation that we are experiencing in almost all cities. Because now we have to give people more of a reason to come into the downtown spaces. And it's not just enough to say, come to work. Certainly the workspaces behind the building walls have changed and must change. And I think Hudson's is going to be a stellar example of a building that creates such a warmth and has the appropriate amenities that folks will hopefully want to come to work. But in addition to that, we've also paid a critical amount of attention to creating much more entertainment and vitality to the downtown spaces through retail offerings, through restaurant offerings, and also literally creating a community space where we intend to program that space in a manner that people will come into that space and create these days we call them Instagrammable moments, and art and energy and music and events, all those kinds of activities that we think will encourage people to move into the downtown, linger downtown, come with family and friends, and not only experience perhaps whatever we may have brought to that space, but then stick around and grab a bite to eat or grab a drink.
Kofi, just tell us about the big vision thing then. So you're talking here about Bedrock, a company that obviously believes in longevity, commitment to place. You're very much rooted within the state, within the city. And you're looking here at some things which we could maybe call legacy as well. What's the thought of Bedrock about what Detroit could look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? What's the vision piece?
The vision piece is to have folks who are born in Detroit commit to stay in Detroit. Folks who are educated in Michigan commit to stay in Michigan, perhaps move into the downtown and the environs. Those who used to live in Detroit, and there are many, decide to come back to Detroit. And businesses that are thinking of growing their businesses choose to relocate into Detroit. Because when you do all those things, it typically means that you have a very vibrant economy and you have been able to create that place where people are comfortably living, working, playing, and frankly, ideating. That's what we are attempting to do. And I think that's what we are indeed doing. So 5 years from now, we expect more people to be coming in to live in the downtown. We expect more people to be working downtown. We expect more people to be choosing specifically to come to downtown to satisfy whatever they would like to do. Look, you typically want somebody to say, I don't quite know what I want to do right now, but I think I'll just go to downtown Detroit because I know once I get there, I will have options.
You're describing a really vibrant city, but I wanted to get your personal take, because you're someone who's moved to Detroit. You originally, I believe, from Ghana. You came to the US to go to university. Of all the cities you could maybe make your career in, you've got Detroit. What is it about Detroit that appeals to you?
I came to Detroit 3.5 years ago. You're absolutely right. Originally from Ghana. I actually grew up in England, in Surrey. I lived in Ghana a little bit. I went to Berkeley, as you point out. Most of my professional career was in the San Francisco Bay Area. Spent a great deal of time doing master plan community buildings in the San Francisco Bay Area. But I did spend about 7.5, 8 years in Cleveland. Cleveland's only about 2.5, 3 hours from Detroit. But I was in Cleveland between 1998 and 2006. And that was not a great time for the city of Detroit. So I remember it well. And so when I was asked to come and take a look at taking the helm here of Bedrock, I wasn't sure, but I came into Detroit and immediately I saw the transformation was well underway. But more importantly than that, I felt, even though this was frankly in 2020 in the heart of COVID, I felt there was something really special in this city. And I felt that the direction was clear and the vision was even clearer. And it just was everything I've always wanted to do, which is work in an urban setting, focusing not just on the bottom line, as important as that is, but also trying to put all the various pieces together that would grow business, create innovation, and work, of course, with the public sector, because that's a critically important part of this. And we could do it in a time frame to prove that indeed, if you do have passion, if you do have commitment, if you have vision, and if you have obviously capital, you are able to create a turnaround that ultimately will affect your bottom line positively. And in doing so, perhaps others will take note that it is indeed possible to revive some of these urban centers and think of a different model of doing it. And that opportunity was clear to me, and that is what drew me to Detroit.
Kofi Bonner, thank you for joining me. This is The Urbanist. To Pittsburgh next. Hazelwood Green is rebuilding Pittsburgh riverfront as a place for innovation, creativity and well-being, creating an area that will become home to research facilities, sports areas, greenery and much more. Sitting in the intersection of long-established communities, it was important to include residents along the development's journey, to ensure that this becomes a sustainable, inclusive and, of course, equitable place. Todd Stern is the managing director at U3 Advisors, the real estate advisory firm who's been working on the transformation of Hazelwood Green. He spoke with Monocle's Carlotta Ribello, who began by asking him about the history of the site.
So Hazelwood Green sits on the banks of the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh, which is one of the three rivers of Pittsburgh, and sits adjacent to a neighborhood called Hazelwood that has been around for many, many decades. Hazelwood Green was historically a location of steel mills for decades, 100 years, that provided strong middle-class wages for hundreds, if not thousands, of workers over the generations, but also at the same time contributed to pollutants entering both the ground, the water, and the atmosphere. When the steel mills closed down, there were a number of different possibilities that people looked at for what to do with this 200-acre site with a mile of waterfront on it. Some folks thought it would be great as a warehousing district or distribution. Folks thought maybe that they would put new steel mills onto the site, none of which I think were opportunities to help the city and the region transition from its kind of industrial heritage to a new economy, an innovation economy, to provide healthy, clean jobs and economic growth opportunities. So the foundations, in a somewhat unusual move, formed a partnership together. This is the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation, the Richard King Mellon Foundation, and the Heinz Endowments to together purchase the site. And their vision was to develop Hazelwood Green in a way that would be environmentally sustainable for generations, that would provide a template or a substrate for equitable, affordable development that provided economic and financial benefits to this historic neighborhood that had worked at the site for so many years, and to do it in a way that displayed excellence in design, sustainability, equity, and affordability.
You nodded there a bit to its future uses, but perhaps talk to us about some of its features. There'll be a hub for manufacturing, I believe, a multi-sports facility, of course, greenery and a park that features heavily as well as part of the project. Tell me a bit more about those details.
So I think part of the concept in designing this place was to leverage the city's strongest areas of economic activity. Certainly the education and the healthcare sectors are producing some of the greatest economic growth in the city and the region, and that's really anchored by the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon University, of course, being a world-class leader in robotics and artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing, and the University of Pittsburgh really leading the way in their partnership with University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in developing life-saving gene-based therapeutics. And that became particularly acutely clear during the pandemic when we found that so many of the kinds of gene or cell-based therapies that we would need to address the pandemic and other health crises around the United States were not being produced stateside, but abroad. And so nationally, we've seen an effort to bring more of that scaled manufacturing capacity back to the United States. And so one of the things we'll be doing on the site, and we're under construction now with the University of Pittsburgh, is creating a biomanufacturing facility that will develop and prototype and then be able to manufacture at scale some of these very targeted gene and cell-based therapies. And then at the same time, Carnegie Mellon is now under construction with what we know as the Robotics Innovation Center, which is a facility that will serve as a test bed to develop new advanced manufacturing techniques, robotic techniques, to aid in manufacturing and make our manufacturing more productive, more efficient, and that we think will be a really substantial draw in terms of bringing other companies and industry to want to locate near or co-locate with this robotic center, just because the capabilities there will be quite unique. But beyond those two facilities, Hazelwood Green is really envisioned as a sustainable and affordable mixed-use environment. So as you noted, we will have lots of green space, park space throughout the site. And in fact, today we already have a really well-activated 2-acre public plaza in use. We'll have a mix of affordable and market rate housing. We will have other traditional office space. And then at the grade, we'll certainly have a mix of retail, food, and beverage that will attract people, throughout the course of the day to the site. Finally, I just want to know, again, we have this over 1 mile riverfront on the Monongahela that has been closed to the public for 100 years when the site was a steel mill. We've now completed a master plan for the redevelopment of that waterfront and hope that in the coming years, we'll be able to open up a first phase that will bring people down to the water in a safe way, that they can engage in the water, be close to it, and just take in the majestic views and opportunities to be on the water in a variety of different ways.
Well, you mentioned there the riverfront, and earlier you were talking about, the location of the site and the neighbouring community and existing community. And it brings me to the question exactly of this importance of connecting residents and visitors of the area with the riverfront, and just how vital that has been as a thread throughout this project.
The foundations made a commitment a long time ago that whatever we do at Hazelwood Green has to be designed in part to benefit and accommodate the needs of residents in the neighborhood. many of whom were left bereft when the steel mills pulled out and all those jobs went away. And this is a neighborhood that's been struggling for now a few decades economically. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the nature of our partnership with the residents of Hazelwood, with their community leaders, and ways that we can make the site culturally and physically accessible and equitable and participatory. We do that in the way that we program our public spaces really deliberately. We do that in the way that we took in feedback and engagement around the master plan for the riverfront. And we do it in a host of other programmatic ways. We also engage pretty heavily with our community partners on thinking about opportunities for workforce development down the road as new tenants, new opportunities come to the site, how we can create sustainable jobs that can serve not just the region, but specifically some of the residents in this neighborhood.
Todd Stern there, speaking with Carlotta Rebello. Finally today, we're in Queens in New York, where one particular architecture firm has been tasked with a variety of projects hoping to revive the area. FX Collaborative has been applying its sustainable design principles to help bring new life to the borough through a mix of residential, commercial and medical facilities. Congestion pricing, high rents and economic demands have been driving a shift from the predominantly Chinese community of Chinatown in Manhattan to Flushing in Queens, making this the best time to create a neighbourhood that can become a vibrant urban centre for all residents. Dan Kaplan is a senior partner at FX Collaborative, and he joined me earlier to give me a snapshot of the projects that they're working on in the area.
Queens is the second most populous borough, and it is a fascinating microcosm of the world, actually. There are 120 nationalities represented in Queens, and there are 200 languages spoken in Queens. So it's really a melting pot. And in this day and age where there is all these pressures of migration and immigration and fear of people coming from other places, I think Queens stands as really a wonderful example of this great internationalist mixing of people, ethnicities. So what's interesting about Queens also urbanistically is that on the west edge of it, as it faces Manhattan, Long Island City and its waterfront is really the density of Manhattan, and it is growing, and we're doing a lot of planning and urban design work. This is seen as a former brownfields, former industrial area that's really ripe for redevelopment. And on the eastern side, it's really starting to get into the leafy suburbs. And what you have across the east to west girth of the borough is this sort of gradual de-densification, if you will. And so there's every flavor of urbanism under the sun.
Now tell me, FX Collaborative, you've been doing lots of work here, but 3 key projects. You're working in particular with Chinese American developers. Could you explain why this is and what trend this is picking up on?
You know, we tend to, in New York, and I'm sure the impression is that, you know, the Chinese American community is based around Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. And actually, the biggest concentration of Chinese Americans is Flushing, which is just near LaGuardia Airport and the tennis center for those of you who go to the US Open. So it's right there. And it really is a vibrant, wonderful, dense area. It's also a rapidly evolving and maturing neighborhood where there is an influx of offshore money and people wanting to live there and buy apartments there and invest there. And so you've seen this sort of maturing of the buildings from, you know, something sort of lower expectation buildings, let's say like 10, 15 years ago, to now where you really are getting interesting design and forward-looking architecture. And we've just completed this wonderful project called New Sun Tower for Sunlight Development. They're Chinese American developers, and we designed a building that really has 2 interlocking uses. There's medical office use, residential condominiums, apartments, very small but with great views, and retail and parking. And this was like a 3-dimensional puzzle, and we were able to create a forward, stunning piece of architecture that you can see from all over the place. And it really set the tone for the sort of next wave of development in Flushing.
You mentioned that it has medical facilities, it has retail space, it's got residential. Are these almost like communities within themselves? And are there particular demands that the developers are seeing and you're responding to as architects that the community needs when you're serving a very particular community?
It's been so interesting. There's a few things. One is, of course, there's feng shui, which is basically a way of designing and a way of looking at space and a way of making sure that the space and the buildings are harmonious. And the design went through a feng shui review. The second is, on a sort of more prosaic end of things, it's a very commercially motivated approach to residential and the medical office spaces where people are buying these as investment properties. The same thing is interestingly true of the medical office. There's a very high demand for medical offices, and a quirk in the New York City zoning is that medical offices are not deemed commercial. They're deemed a use called community facility. And so this site allowed for that, and the developer took advantage of it. What was really interesting is the way all the functions intertwined on this very, very tight and complex site. And it really was like a Jenga puzzle, and we put it all together.
And Dan, you have two other big projects, Rich House and Vernon Boulevard. Are these in a similar mold as they serve the same community? Were you finding the same kind of needs and demands being put in front of you?
Rich House is very similar. In that one, we had an intertwining of, again, to maximize the full capacity of the site, we had residential condominium intertwined with hotel use, again, in a very similar type of arrangement in that these are like two buildings that are coexisting on the site. They sort of interlock and intertwine, but they're really like buildings within buildings, if you will. The Vernon Boulevard project is a little bit different. It's a little bit further out. It's actually right on the waterfront, facing Manhattan, very close to actually the Noguchi Museum, and it's a lower rise context and serves almost like the suburbs of Flushing, if you will. It's leafier, and I think this will serve a broader community.
We've watched and dipped into the story of New York, which, like many cities, including the city we sit in, London, has seen some tests and trials and tribulations post-pandemic, and the soothsayers will tell you anything almost you want to hear. You're obviously involved in some very confident developments in Queens, and you're involved in the shifting demographics of that city. What's your snapshot when you tour the city, when you look at the projects coming up? What do you see as the challenges and opportunities today for an architecture firm like yours and for developers working in New York?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that post-pandemic, you are seeing the accelerated growth and densification of these neighborhoods that are one tier away or two concentric circles away from the Manhattan core. So where I live in Fort Greene in Brooklyn, during the pandemic, you really actually saw a more blossoming of street life. It was always good, but more street life, more retail, as people spend more time in their residential neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods that are thriving generally tend to be the non-monocultures, meaning that they have residential, they have some commercial, they have some office, they have retail, they have hotel, they have academic uses, they have medical uses. So the more polyglot neighborhoods are actually thriving because people are spending more time in their 15-minute city type neighborhoods, as opposed to pre-pandemic. The model was, it's so ironic that people in Queens and Brooklyn say, oh, I went into the city today, meaning I went into Manhattan. So pre-pandemic, everybody would see Manhattan as absolutely the center, and it was a hub and spoke. And I see the thing that's happening in a very interesting way is this polycentric city that's sort of was nascent, but the pandemic gave it a shot in the arm. And as I said before, given the population pressures, you're just seeing these interesting blossomings of Jamaica, Queens, and Long Island City, and Flushing, and downtown Brooklyn, and Broadway Junction, and all of these places that are now becoming these polycentric centers.
Dan Kaplan there from FX Collaborative in New York. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. You can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. And you can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye. Thank you for listening, City Lovers.